Do you believe that America can be considered a reliable ally any longer?
I believe that the answer is yes, with a question mark, which is there's enough uncertainty about the fact that we're asking that question that countries are making their own calculus, their own assessment. My concern is this: I don't think the jury's still out on the answer to that question. But my concern is that countries are looking at this, looking at the uncertainty, looking at the unpredictability.
Yeah.
And they're saying we have to make a new calculation.
Yes.
We have to think about making ourselves less dependent
Yes.
on the United States. We have to look at working around or away from
Yes.
the United States. We're spending more on if we're spending more on defense, maybe we're not spending it on American products.
Yes.
Not such a good thing from our perspective.
Yes.
So I think the fact that the question is posed,
Yes.
even if the answer is not yet definitive,
Right.
is in and of itself a problem.
Antony Blinken, thank you so much for joining us. It's good to have you here.
Good to be with you, John.
Let me ask you this then, first of all. President Trump is in the Gulf in Saudi Arabia today. He's not visiting Israel on this trip, but we can be sure that Gaza will be on the agenda. And Arab leaders no doubt calling for better treatment for Palestinians, among other things. Now let's immediately agree that the conduct of Hamas has been atrocious. It has been murderous. But what I'd like to ask you first, as a friend of Israel and as a Jewish American, what do you say to those who believe the conduct of Israel now counts as a war crime? I'm thinking of those agencies and NGOs who say starvation is being used as a weapon of war.
Look, we were incredibly intent on a few things when President Biden was in office. One was making sure after October 7th that it couldn't happen again, that the attack that Israel was the subject of would never be repeated. We wanted to make sure that the war didn't get widen out, that others didn't come in. And we wanted to look out for those, particularly Palestinians in Gaza, who are caught in this crossfire of Hamas's making. And so it was a struggle to try to make sure that we were doing all three things at the same time. The human suffering that took place and continues to take place in Gaza is horrific on so many levels. But particularly over the last couple of months, not having any assistance get into Gaza, I think is doing terrible damage to people who, again, are caught in something that is not of their own making, that they didn't start and that they themselves are powerless to stop. So I think it is incumbent, and I believe the Trump administration has also made this clear, it is incumbent upon Israel, even as it looks out for its security, even as it tries to deal with the ongoing problem posed by Hamas, that Palestinian civilians in Gaza get the assistance that they need to survive.
That's difficult to dispute. My direct question was that the starvation as a weapon, the deliberate denial of humanitarian aid counts, I think, as a war crime. Well, is Israel therefore, in your view, guilty of a war crime?
I think the experts can look and evaluate the law, what it requires, but irrespective of that, again, in my judgment, there should not be effectively a blockade on assistance getting into people who desperately need it. Whatever that is, whatever you want to call it, it shouldn't be happening. Now, look,
it is though you feel a legitimate question.
Of course, it's a legitimate question, but what's equally, I think, disturbing throughout this horrific period that we've lived since October 7th is I'd also like to see more pressure, more focus on Hamas and on what it's done to put people in this terrible, terrible predicament.
Yes.
And I really understand and feel strongly the passions of people who are more than upset with situation for Palestinians in Gaza and Israel's policies. It would also be, I think, beneficial if they spent maybe 10% of their time putting that same pressure on Hamas.
Yeah, and as I say, I think it's impossible to dispute the behavior, the conduct of Hamas has been truly appalling. We can take that as a head of agreement for the purpose of this conversation. In office, you had it within your power to deny Israel the weapons they need to prosecute this war. The Trump administration has that power now. Do you have any regrets about the way you did not use that power, Mr. Blinken?
So, John, I think, as I said before, we were trying to balance a number of competing things, goals, objectives. One of them was to try to make sure that as bad as this war was, it didn't broaden out on other fronts. And unfortunately, many other countries and groups, enemies of Israel that sought its destruction, were poised to also attack. And part of making sure that they didn't was making sure that Israel had the deterrent, that it had the military resources it needed, that said to these other groups or countries, Iran, for example, don't do it.
Right.
So it was very important to make sure
that sense.
Look, you always go back and look, could we have done something differently in a different way? You're always going to ask yourself that question. But we had to try to balance all of these things out.
Okay, look, you said at the Atlantic Council in January that Hamas has recruited as many fighters now as they have lost in the conflict. Does that then mean that Israeli and American policy has been a comprehensive failure?
I think two things. Israel has succeeded in eliminating the military capacity of Hamas, that is, the organized military capacity to redo an attack like October 7th. What it hasn't done, and in my judgment, what it can't do, is eliminate all of the Hamas fighters. And yes, as I said, it was our assessment then that they more or less recruited to their ranks as many people as Hamas had lost. And what does that mean, John? It means that right now, where this is Israel has on its hands basically an insurgency that's unlikely to be resolved anytime soon. It's going to be stuck with it. What we were working on very hard and what we came a long way to achieving but didn't quite get there was to have a plan for what would follow this initial ceasefire that we did achieve. The 6 weeks, hostages released, Palestinian prisoners also sent back, but then you have to have something to fill in. What can fill in such that Israel can get out of Gaza, Hamas is not in control, and Gaza can move forward? And that requires some transitional authorities, Arab countries and others, taking on the administration, taking on security, and then eventually handing over to the Palestinians. We got most of the way there. We handed that off to the new administration. We haven't seen follow through on that.
No, we will have to see whether anything develops from that idea, from the Egyptians among others. Before we move on from the Gulf, perhaps it's a different order of topic, but President Trump is being gifted a luxury Boeing 747 by Qatar. He says, what's the problem? He's saving the American taxpayer $400 million. Do you think, Mr. Blinken, that the president, for these or other reasons, can he be accused fairly of being corrupt?
Look, it raises all sorts of questions that I think we need answers to. As a general proposition, including as a constitutional question, getting gifts from foreign governments above a certain level is something that's not done.
It's illegal, isn't it, under the Emoluments Act?
On the Emoluments
Clause.
So
is the president corrupt? Is that a fair point?
The lawyers will look at this. They'll go back and forth on all of this. But I think it raises a lot of questions. First, there's the practical question, which is, if this goes forward, how much time would it take to get this plane ready so that it could be used? What are the security implications? This is the Air Force One. I've traveled on it over the years many times, probably hundreds of times, with President Clinton, President Obama, President Biden. It's also supposed to be a really secure facility so that the president can do his business. I wouldn't want to be getting Air Force One from any foreign country because that does raise real questions. So I think it poses a lot of questions that are both of an ethical nature but also a security nature.
Right. So again, it is a legitimate question to raise the question of corruption in the Oval Office. You feel?
I think that as you're looking at this, as you look at the blending together, the mixing of personal business interests with the business of the country, of the state, it of course raises questions that need to be answered.
Okay, let's move on to Ukraine, if we may. At the weekend, European leaders, of course, the leaders of Germany, France, Poland, and the United Kingdom got together. They handed Vladimir Putin an ultimatum. They said, declare a ceasefire, sit down for talks, and do that now, or face harsh sanctions. And General Kellogg, the Ukraine-Russia envoy of President Trump, he said that's correct. He supported it and said President Trump supported it too. Hours later, President Trump said the precise opposite and echoed the words of Vladimir Putin. He demanded that President Zelensky of Ukraine should sit down with no preconditions. Mr. Blinken, has Ukraine been betrayed by the United States?
Well, remember, before President Trump took office during the campaign, he said he would solve Ukraine in a matter of 24 hours. And now here we are, whatever it is, 120 days later, that hasn't happened. I do think there's a little bit of frustration that's crept in because Putin has not played ball with that objective. But, this was a very fast-moving piece. And exactly as you said, European leaders got together, said, let's have a 30-day unconditional ceasefire. Putin said, no, but I'll have direct talks. President Trump apparently supported that. Zelensky then said, okay, I'll join talks myself personally.
Yeah.
If we haven't heard a response from the Russians.
Well, look, can President Trump, Mr. Blinken, be reasonably said to be on the side of the Kremlin? Many people are saying that, as you know.
Look, I think he wants to see an end to the war. And the real question is...
That wasn't quite my question.
Yeah.
Do you consider he's on the side of the Kremlin?
It's not a question of... John, I don't think it's a question of sides in the sense that from the president's perspective, my understanding is, as I read it, he wants to see an end to this. The question is, how do you get to an end? I think he's put too much pressure on Ukraine.
Yes.
Not enough pressure on Putin and on Russia. That's the distinction. But if you're going to get to an end to this, what's likely to happen? I think at some point over the course of the year, there's a decent prospect of getting a ceasefire. Not a settlement, not a resolution of all the issues, but some kind of ceasefire. The question of whether that ceasefire holds, whether it's a durable ceasefire, is going to depend entirely on whether some kind of deterrent is built in such that Putin can't simply rest, refit, and reattack. That's the real question. So, for example, if there is a ceasefire, will there be an agreement to have some European forces basically patrolling whatever the line of demarcation is, backed by the United States? If something like that happens, I think Putin won't repeat. If we don't have that, I think we're heading to a ceasefire that doesn't last, and the war simply starts up again.
The President's shown no sign of agreeing to that.
We'll see. I mean, I think he's certainly hearing that from the Europeans. And if he wants something that's actually durable, and also, if he doesn't want to see Ukraine lost on his watch, I would hope and expect that he would stand up in a way that at least gets us to a ceasefire that's durable.
Like if Putin does not agree to a ceasefire on Thursday in Istanbul, if he doesn't turn up at all, do you trust the President to live up to his rhetoric and impose harsh sanctions on Russia? There's been talk of that, there's been no action.
No.
Do you personally believe that would happen, that he would do that?
Well, first, let's keep in mind that there already are incredibly harsh sanctions that are on Russia and that have been sustained. Look, the sanctions have had a real impact on Russia. The export controls have had a real impact. Russia's also found some workarounds. I think the other interesting question now is this. If you're going to sustain support for Ukraine, not only military support, but also financial support, what is to be done about the Russian sovereign assets that are frozen in Europe, about $300 billion worth? That is actually the best way to use those assets to make sure that Ukraine has what it needs economically, that it will also continue to buy military equipment as it needs it. That's sitting right there. And I think from the perspective of European taxpayers, for example, better that Russia's money is spent on something that it's now broken, and so it owns, in a sense, than anything else. So even as we're looking at what kind of sustained support the United States could, and in my judgment should provide, we should also look at the fact that those assets are sitting there and could and should be used.
Okay, let's look at NATO and security. European members of NATO are increasing their spending on their own and each other's defence, as urged by Washington. And one could say about time, too, to that. But some of those leaders, Friedrich Merz of Germany, for example, is saying that European allies can no longer rely on America as an ally. You're nodding. Do you agree with that? Do you agree that, as the Wall Street Journal said the other day, that President Trump's administration has retreated from the defense of freedom?
I think it's a question for sure that Europeans, and not just Europeans, other allies and partners around the world, including in Asia, are at least asking themselves. Now, two things. We have seen Europe step up more on defense spending. When President Biden took office, 9 of the NATO allies were spending 2% of GDP on defense, as they'd all agreed to do way back in 2014 at the NATO summit in Wales. When President Biden left office, 23 of the NATO allies were doing that. Now, largely that was a response to Putin and the concerns that they had. But it was also a response to the encouragement that they were getting from the United States. There's no doubt that Europe should continue to do more for its own defense. And I think we're hearing that from Merz, we're hearing that from Macron, we're hearing it from Keir Starmer. And I hope we see that. But this is a challenge too, because one of the things we found throughout Ukraine was that when it comes to actually producing more, it's not simply a matter of money. You have a thing called a defense industrial base, your productive capacity when it comes to defense. It turns out it's really hard to turn that on in a way that produces things in a timely fashion. That's part of the challenge for Europe as well.
I mean, feel free to answer this next question with a single word, if you like. Do you believe that America can be considered a reliable ally any longer?
I believe that the answer is yes, with a question mark, which is there's enough uncertainty about the fact that we're asking that question that countries are making their own calculus, their own assessment. My concern is this. I don't think the jury's still out on the answer to that question. But my concern is that countries are looking at this, looking at the uncertainty, looking at the unpredictability.
Yes.
And they're saying we have to make a new calculation.
Yes.
We have to think about making ourselves less dependent
Yes.
on the United States. We have to look at working around or away from
Yes.
the United States. We're spending more on if we're spending more on defense, maybe we're not spending it on American products.
Yes.
Not such a good thing from our perspective.
Yeah.
So I think the fact that the question is posed,
Yes.
even if the answer is not yet definitive,
Right.
is in and of itself a problem.
And that in itself, I think, is a relatively clear answer. If the jury is out on the question of whether America is any longer a reliable ally, the answer then is maybe, maybe not.
Yeah. Countries want it to be. And look,
But the answer is maybe not.
and then as countries are making this assessment, making this calculation, they're going to be making decisions. The challenge is, once a decision is made, let's say that you think that the United States is no longer a reliable trading partner, you make other arrangements, you try to work around the United States, cut deals with others, change your supply chains. It's hard to pull that back in.
Yeah.
So these decisions are consequential ones.
Right. Members of the administration, Mr. Blinken, Tulsi Gabbard, Steve Witkoff, they've been described as being favorable, sympathetic to Moscow. The Pentagon, the pinnacle of the American military establishment, is in chaos. There have been leaks on social media of highly classified military pieces of information. Are you worried that America's allies may now be, or could grow, wary of sharing intelligence with Washington?
Look, I think that's got to be a concern. Again, this is something that I hear. But take a step back just for a second.
So you said that's something you hear?
Oh yes, I
From
think as you have conversations with friends around the world, they at least ask this question. They raise this question, and certainly it's part of the
European
conversation.
leaders, you mean, are raising
Europeans
that point privately.
in Northeast Asia, etc. But John, when you step back, here's the larger dynamic that I see. My sense is that as President Trump looks at the world, there are a couple of things he looks at. He looks to, from his perspective, strong leaders or strong countries. And the leaders that he sees as strong leaders are Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping,
Yes.
maybe Modi in India, Erdogan in Turkey, MBS in Saudi Arabia. Honestly, when he looks at Europe, I think he sees a continent that's not strong, that from his perspective, that's not united, that's a weaker actor. And so I think part of the challenge for Europe to be taken seriously by the president is to show greater cohesiveness, greater unity, greater common purpose, because then Europe has to be taken in a more serious manner.
I do find it alarming, what you have just told me, that you are hearing privately. I won't ask you to name the European leaders you're talking about, but you are hearing in confidence that these leaders are not convinced they can safely share intelligence with America. That is a serious fault line in the transatlantic alliance, isn't it?
Yeah, and look, we've had incidents in the past, so this is not something that's totally new, where there's been one kind or another an intelligence challenge, and that's raised questions on people's minds. I certainly hope that the necessary reassurances have been given so that people retain that trust and confidence, because it goes to the security of the United States.
No, but is that trust and confidence merited after the leaks, the chaos at the Pentagon?
When you have a problem of that nature, the question then becomes, what do you do about it? And if what you do about it can restore confidence, good. And by the way, this is usually important to the United States because we're depending on allies and partners around the world for so much of this intelligence and so much of this information. So many of our friends and partners have eyes and ears where we don't. And so if you lose that, it's bad for everyone.
Yeah, but you are describing a serious, serious worry about the strength of what was once a strong transatlantic alliance.
And I believe has to be, but in order to do that, you've got to maintain trust or build back trust if it's lost.
Build back trust. Can we talk about trade and tariffs? Yesterday we saw China and the United States draw back and scale back their tariffs, one against the other. Was that, Mr. Blinken, a victory for Donald Trump's hardball style of negotiating, or was it a retreat? A surrender?
From my perspective, it was, look, I'm glad that they did it. It's good that they pulled back, but here's the reality. If you're looking at this from Beijing's perspective, what you're seeing is a United States that talks the talk, but then can't walk the walk, because once there was some heat generated, we saw markets react very badly to this. We saw the prospect of there being no toys under Christmas trees at the end of the year. We pulled back. What did we get for it? Nothing. China's not committed to do anything. The only thing it committed to do was to remove the reciprocal tariffs it had put in place in response to the tariffs that President Trump put in place. And now there'll be a conversation over the course of 90 days to see if some of the underlying issues that we're concerned about will actually be addressed. Meanwhile, we still have a 30% tariff on China. That's big. That's a lot. And we still have this uncertainty because there's a 90-day period, and if you're trying to make decisions about what's going to happen in the future, you really don't know. So yes, seen in this moment, I think this was a real step back, and China's in a stronger negotiating position as a result.
Right. So America, in that sense, or the administration, the loser. I saw the Wall Street Journal today saying that the president declared war on Adam Smith, the free market philosopher, and lost. Just a brief word on Britain, on the United Kingdom, where the British Prime Minister, he says the deal secured by the United Kingdom was a product of his pragmatic, not performative approach. Is that the best way to handle the president? Never criticise, strike an emollient tone, avoid angering him, and avoid retribution. Is that the way to do it?
Look, honestly, I'm not in the business of giving advice to my foreign friends on this. I listen to them, but they have to make decisions about the best way forward to advance their interests and to make sure that they're adequately looked out for. So different people make different judgments about the best way to proceed. I have great respect for the Prime Minister. I had the great pleasure of being able to work with him over the last roughly 6 months of our administration, and I'm fully confident he knows exactly what he's doing.
All right, now time's running out for us. Again, thank you so much for taking time for this. A brief question or two on American politics. You worked very closely. You were so close to President Biden during his term in office. Mr. Blinken, can you tell me, with your hand on your heart, that you really believed in the later stages of President Biden's presidency that America and the free world had a leader who was completely fit to discharge his duties as president and run for a second term?
Well, there's two different questions. And here's why. When it comes to everything that we did during the president's administration, every single decision, every single judgment was a decision or a judgment made by President Biden, not by any of the rest of us. And as someone who participated in so many of these conversations, at least on foreign policy and national security, he was the one driving this. He was the one asking the hard questions. He was the one making the hard judgments. And then you can judge us on the record. Some people don't like it, other people like it, but there's a clear record, and that's the basis upon which you have to assess whether the president did his job. And I believe he did a historically strong job, and eventually that will be seen. It's a different question to say running for a second term and being president for another 4 years. And ultimately, I believe he concluded, when he really thought about it, that doing it for another 4 years with all the uncertainty that comes with age was something that he couldn't do.
Okay, rather reluctantly. This is the last question, Mr. Blinken. After the 2020 election, President Trump refused to accept the results and still doesn't. Can America be confident about having a free and fair election in 2028?
Well, what I've seen, John, to date is that even when challenged very vigorously, our institutions stand up and stand strong. And I believe as we look at this, that will remain the case and that people can have confidence in that.
Okay, Antony Blinken, thank you so much.
Great to be with you. Thank you.